Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
It had been a very tiring search for a place to stay. Not because there were not enough rooms in London. Many streets, even whole areas, had houses with signs saying, "Rooms for rent," but Miss Sindel had many needs. She needed a cheap place because she did not have much money. She wanted to live near the British Museum because she needed to read many books for her own book, Famous Irish Women. She also wanted a quiet place with nice things around her. For 1 week, she had looked for the right place to stay for a few months. The weather was cold and gray in March. The mornings were dark, and the evenings became dark early. Every day, Miss Sindel climbed many stairs, looking for a good room. At last, after much thought, she decided to stay at a house on Guildford Street, number 30. She took the rooms on the first floor above the street. She was happy with her choice. She paid her bill at the Charing Cross Hotel and went to her new home. The first floor above the street, called the drawing room floor, was the best part of a London lodging house. The person who stayed there was the most important guest. The landlady had to answer their bell quickly. That floor cost more than the rest of the house and was very important for the landlady. Because of this, Miss Sindel was treated like an important person. Her bags were carried upstairs, and the landlady, Mrs. Stone, helped her arrange her things. When everything was in place, Miss Sindel sat in a low chair near the warm fire. She looked around her new home. Mrs. Stone was still cleaning. The door was open, and in the doorway stood a thin, pale child. He was very tall for his face. His big eyes looked at Miss Sindel with a sad, longing expression. At the same moment, Mrs. Stone saw the child and spoke sharply. "Go away, you little trouble. Didn't I tell you not to bother the new lady?" The child's face turned red, and tears came to his big, sad eyes. He started to leave, but Miss Sindel spoke. She was not especially fond of children, but her kind heart felt something for this sad-looking boy. "Don't send him away, Mrs. Stone," she said gently. "Come here, little one. What is your name?" The child stepped inside but said nothing. "Don't be afraid," Miss Sindel said. "What is your name?" "Oh, ma'am, he can't talk," said Mrs. Stone. "He can't talk?" "No. He was born that way. He can hear very well and understands everything, but he cannot speak. The last lady who stayed here said some doctors might help him, but I have no money for that. Johnny is my brother's son. His father died before he was born. His mother lived just long enough to give Johnny to me and ask me to take care of him. I have tried my best, but running a lodging house is hard work. Money is always a problem. I never had enough to take Johnny to a doctor. But you must not let Johnny bother you. The last lady who stayed here said she did not like seeing him. She left partly because of that. Don't worry, Miss Sindel said. Let him sit by the fire. If he bothers me, I will send him away. Mrs. Stone left, and Johnny sat on a small stool near the fire. Miss Sindel read a book, but sometimes she looked at Johnny. His face was still pale and sad, but a small, sad smile was on his lips. He looked at her as if he wanted to remember her face forever. He sat there for an hour. Then Mrs. Stone came to prepare the table for dinner and sent him to bed. The next morning, Johnny came back. Soon he sat near Miss Sandell every day watching her work. Even though she was busy, she thought about him often. Like Johnny, Miss Sandell was also an orphan. She did not have many close friends or family. She started to feel that she should take care of this quiet, lonely boy. She often took breaks from work to read stories to him. His eyes would shine, and his pale face would get some color. She hoped that if her book was successful, she could help Johnny. When she sold the first copies of Famous Irish Women, she would find the best doctor for him. If there was a way to help him speak, she would do it. "Johnny, would you like to talk to me?" she asked one day. Johnny looked at her with wide eyes. Then suddenly he began to cry. He sobbed so hard that Miss Sandell became worried. She gently touched his head. "Don't cry, Johnny. Please don't," she said softly. No one had ever called Johnny dear before. He looked at her through his tears with a happy, surprised smile. Then, in his quiet way, he kissed the edge of her dress and her foot. Miss Sandell felt a deep kindness toward Johnny. From that day, they were always together. She took him on walks, and he stayed near her while she worked. Miss Sandell loved flowers. She didn't like fancy bouquets from shops, but she often brought home simple flowers like violets and forget-me-nots. Sometimes, she bought a single tea rose bud and took great care of it. Johnny noticed how much she loved tea roses. He dreamed of buying her a whole bunch. He thought about it all the time, but he had never had more than a penny, and even one tea rose cost more than that. One day, Miss Sandell took Johnny to visit a rich friend. She sent him to look at the pictures while she talked. She told her friend Johnny's sad story. The woman was kind and felt sorry for the boy. When it was time to leave, she called Johnny and gave him a silver half-crown. Johnny held the coin close to his heart. He looked at the woman as if asking if it was really his. "Yes, it's all yours," she said. "Don't let anyone take it from you." Johnny would not let anyone take it. To him, the coin meant one thing: tea roses for Miss Sandell. The next day, Johnny got sick. He had a slow fever. His aunt was busy, but Miss Sandell cared for him. She brought him to her room and let him rest on her sofa. She gave him water, kind words, and sweet grapes. One day, Johnny took out the half-crown and gave it to Miss Sandell. He made her understand that she should keep it for him. She put it in her desk drawer. As summer came, Johnny got better. One day, he stood in front of Miss Sandell and held out his hand. She understood and gave him back the half-crown. He hid it in his pocket with a happy look. Miss Sandell smiled. Did this quiet boy care so much about money? As soon as he could stand, Johnny sat on the balcony and watched the street below. Miss Sandell thought he was just enjoying the busy city. She was finishing her book and was glad Johnny had something to keep him entertained. But Johnny had only one thought: tea roses. He watched the flower sellers on the street. Their carts were full of fresh flowers. As they walked by, they shouted, "All growing and blooming." It was a cheerful sound, full of the feeling of summer. Day after day, Johnny sat on the balcony and watched the street. He saw many flowers: red geraniums, white azaleas, and purple violets, but never any tea roses. One morning, he heard the familiar call, "All growing and blooming." He looked and saw them at last. Tea roses, so many tea roses. Miss Sindel was busy with her writing. She didn't notice when Johnny left the balcony and hurried downstairs. He ran down the street, chasing the flower cart. He held his silver half-crown tightly in his small hand. The cart was far ahead, but Johnny ran as fast as he could. Finally, the seller stopped to help a customer, and Johnny caught up, out of breath. He pointed to the tea roses and held out his coin. The flower seller looked at him. "Can't you speak, boy?" he asked. "You want tea roses for this?" Johnny nodded eagerly. The man took a big handful of the sweet flowers and gave them to Johnny, taking the half-crown in return. Johnny held the flowers tightly. He was so happy. Miss Sindel had always loved one tea rose. How much more would she love a whole bunch? His heart felt full of joy. She had called him dear. She had been kind to him. Now he could do something for her. He didn't see the fast-moving butcher's cart coming. He didn't hear it. Then suddenly something pushed him down. The cart rolled over him. Everything went dark. But even then, his small hands held the flowers tight. People ran to help. The butcher boy jumped down from his cart. "It's Mrs. Stone's Johnny," he said. "Help me lift him into the cart. I'll take him home." Johnny made a painful sound as they picked him up, but he never let go of the tea roses. At home, Mrs. Stone cried loudly. Miss Sindel heard the noise and rushed downstairs. "He's dead. Johnny's dead," Mrs. Stone sobbed. Miss Sindel turned pale and hurried to his side. But Johnny was still alive, though barely. The butcher boy ran for a doctor, but there was little hope. Then Johnny saw Miss Sindel. His face lit up. He held out the flowers with the last of his strength and placed them in her hand. Then, something wonderful happened. With great effort, he spoke for the first time. "For you." Miss Sindel kissed his pale face. The flowers touched his cheek. He looked at her, smiling. His eyes were full of happiness. Then he closed them forever.